Hey everybody, Larry Lawton here. This is going to be a good video. This is the top 5 most interesting mob bosses and why. But before I get started, check me out on YouTube, Patreon, Discord. Check my book out, Gangster Redemption, does very well. Of course, the Crooked Diamond Cigar, the whole cigar brand is out, crookeddiamondcigar.com. Check out these fancy boxes. And they are great. They really are, everybody. I'm not just saying that. Now we're going to get into this video. This video is going to be a good video. I'm going to give you my take on the top 5 most interesting mob bosses and why. And I'm going to start right off with John Gotti as number 5. Not the most interesting, but he's on the top 5 of my list. And here is a little bit about John Gotti. John Gotti came of power in 1985 after he killed Paul Castellano. I know a lot about this because I was an associate in this family. That was a pretty trying time, if you want to call it that. But he killed Paul Castellano in Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan right around Christmas. I think it was right around Christmas or Christmas 1985. The why this is so interesting, everybody, is because John Gotti was they called him the Dapper Don. He wore expensive suits. He was very flamboyant. He was out there. And, you know, he put down on his form for his taxes as a plumber. He was a plumbing salesman. That's what he did. Made between $5 and $20 million a year. Think of that. That's some pretty big money. He did it through loan sharking, gambling, construction, extortion, the sex trades, narcotics. They did it through a lot of ways. Now, John Gotti is very interesting in my mind because here's a guy who came from nothing, had the balls, and this is why, the balls to kill a boss. That is unheard of. Not only does he kill the boss, he doesn't get killed. He actually dies in prison, and he goes to prison in 1992, and he dies in prison of cancer. He had throat cancer, and he was actually in the federal system when I was in there. So that to me is pretty amazing that he lasted that long. But he was too flamboyant. So I made him interesting and on this list because John Gotti did things nobody else did. You know, the mob was known as to be like very low key, behind the scenes. Nobody wanted to be, out there. Most mob bosses lived in regular houses, which John Gotti did too in Queens. But he didn't live in some flamboyant neighborhood, but he wore $2,000 suits. He had the rings. He had entourages where he went. He was a celebrity in New York City. Of course, the FBI is going to want to get him. He's like, snooting his nose at them. He ends up beating 3 major cases. And he ended up, getting to jurors too. But he ended up beating, he had one of the famous lawyers named Bruce Cutler. And they ended up winning a bunch of cases, so they called him the Teflon Don. So the Teflon Don he was untouchable. He was Teflon. He couldn't touch him. So they ended up getting him, and the feds are amazing as what they do. And when they want you, they're going to get you. Trust me on that one. But that's why John Gotti is number 5, and he's one of the most interesting mob bosses of all time. Now we're going to jump into number 4. This is a name I don't know how many people know. It's Jimmy Coonan. Jimmy Coonan was the Irish mob. He was the mob boss from 1977 to 1988, which is my era again, just at the beginning of I came in that life really in 1985, a little bit earlier when I was a young kid, but when I got out of prison, I was muscling card games and stuff of that nature. But that's when I came in. Everybody knew of them. They were in Hell's Kitchen, and that was the Irish mob. And it was called the Westies. The Westies were in Manhattan on the west side in the 50s, high 40s, all of the west side and 11th Avenue stuff. And they ran that neighborhood with a fine-tooth comb. Now, Jimmy Coonan ran his crew and his family with a guy named Mickey Featherstone. Now, Jimmy Coonan, they were known to cut the hands off of people when they murdered them. So now Jimmy Coonan is still alive. He's in jail. And as of now, he's in Lewisburg Penitentiary, where I was at. So Jimmy Coonan becomes very interesting to me because He's gonna get out. Possibly he's up for parole. They don't want to give him parole, but he was up for parole since 1998. Will he get out? I don't know. You know, the judge didn't want him to get out, but he's still alive. Here's one of the guys to me today that are alive, and it's amazing because most of these guys on this list are dead. Actually, the 4 or the 5 are dead, or number 2 is not. But we're gonna get to that in a minute. So Jimmy Coonan is number 4, and here's why. Here's a guy who came from the streets, had nothing, and he built up his own crew on muscle. That's where they made their bones. They made their bones by doing hits for the regular mafia. They worked for a guy named Roy DeMeo, who was a captain in the Gambino crime family, who were known for the biggest car stealing ring, and they were killing people left and right in that crew. They were cutting up bodies and putting them in dumpsters around the city. They were actually cutting the bodies up, putting them in boxes, and putting them in trash cans. So that crew that was the Roy DeMeo crew, but Jimmy Coonan worked for that guy, and he ended up becoming head of the Westies. And the Westies to this day were known, they were a tough Irish mob. You didn't want to play with the Westies. I'm telling you that. You did not want to play with the Westies. Let's get to number 3 on my list of most interesting mob bosses. The next one is Pablo Escobar. Now, Pablo Escobar was born in 1949. He ended up dying in 1993. I remember this one. He was actually the wealthiest mob boss of all time. He was worth $30 billion, which is equivalent to $70 billion in today's money in 2022. But when he died, when he was at his height of his power, $30 billion. An amazing man. And Pablo Escobar founded the Medellin cartel in 1970. The Medellin cartel was importing between 70 and 80 tons of cocaine into the United States monthly. Think of that number, 70 to 80 tons of cocaine monthly into the United States. So is it a massive operation, the Medellin cartel? In 1982, Pablo Escobar actually went into the Congress under the Liberal Party in Colombia. Believe that. Here is a mob boss becomes somewhat legitimate, if you want to call it that, but he's a mob boss. So now he's in government, which is probably the biggest racketeers in the world. So Pablo Escobar ended up blowing up a big, big building, which killed a lot of people. And that really turned a lot of the tide of the people even against Pablo Escobar. But he still, to the end, he built and owned half of Medellin. And that's why he became a hero. He really built a lot of stuff in the slums. He took over and built schools, built playgrounds. He built a lot of stuff for the community. So he did give back to the community. You want to call it a Robin Hood syndrome. I understand it because that's something like I did. Not even at an eighth of a thousandth of a level of what he did. I used to do a lot for the community, but Pablo Escobar became very loved in his community. But he wasn't loved by the United States government. And the United States government, with their high technology, actually gave it to the Colombian police, and they ended up finding him. They ended up shooting him down. He was in a middle-class neighborhood, and he ended up being in a room, and they came there. And by tracking him on a phone, he jumped out on the balcony. He went, and they ended up shooting him there and killed him dead. And, you know, they took pictures of him, and I remember this when it happened. It was like a trophy. It looked like, you know, some kind of hunt they were on. And that it threw the country into a free-for-all. And that is when the Cali cartel took over from the Medellin cartel. It's not like when you stop one drug dealer, you're going to, you know, stop the drug trade. It's too much money. And that's why I believe in bail. And I talked about that a little bit. Give him all bail. Give him a $30 million bail. If he jumps bail, we keep the money. But what makes Pablo Escobar so interesting to me is he came from nothing. He was a peasant himself. He rised. He helped a lot of people, believe it or not. I know I'm sounding like, oh, this guy, a good guy. You know what? He had some good traits. Everybody does. Did he try to do things differently? Absolutely. Was he violent? Absolutely. But if you don't think the government you're living in is not violent, Think again. Besides that, he actually is one of the only mob bosses ever to, one, be the richest, two, get into government. He literally got into government. And that's what makes him the most interesting. How he helped people, how he got into government, and how he was still hated by the United States and a lot of people. Yes, drugs are not right. And he was the biggest drug dealer in the world at that time, and probably still is one of the biggest drug dealers ever. And Pablo Escobar had to make my list at number 3. Let's go to number 2. Simeon Mokolevich. Simeon Mokolevich is a Ukrainian Russian, that's what it was back then, Ukrainian Russian mobster who's still on the run today. There's a $5 million reward for him. Here's what makes him so interesting. He has an economics degree. This guy's not an idiot. He's dealing in money laundering, mail fraud, arms dealing, human trafficking, some drugs, and murder. This guy is the top of the list. He is a vicious, smart guy. He has 8 aliases and over 4 passports that they know of. So he's all over the place. He's a pretty smart guy, and he's still on the run. That makes him very interesting to me. And here's a guy that has figured out a way to run around the world, literally, and become a mobster in every part of the world. When you're in Canada doing stuff, you're in parts of Europe doing stuff, and you're in Ukraine, everywhere else doing stuff, that makes it something. And he is on the list of every agency from Interpol to enough, and they have a $5 million reward for him. You don't see that too often. So this guy is very interesting because there's not much known. They know who he is. They know what he does. They know how smart he is, but you're not seeing beat a trial here, beat a trial there, because he doesn't get caught. That's what makes this guy good. Will he get caught? I don't know. The government, does the government want to catch him? Governments are pretty corrupt. So do they want him to be caught? I'm sure with arms dealing, you're dealing with a lot of people with the government. And that's where they get their stuff. They get their arms from governments, and they sell them to governments. So what governments are actually helping this man hide out? You don't know. You'll be surprised when it all comes out. Let's jump to number 1. And number 1, Alphonse Gabriel Capone. Yes, Al Capone. You heard of his name. Everybody hears his name. Well, why is he interesting? First of all, he was born in 1899, and he died in 1947, so he was only 48 years old. He came to power at 28 years old. Think of that. He was also, Alphonse Capone, very violent. He actually was public enemy number 1 in Chicago. Public enemy number 1 declared then, and this is after buying politicians. Alphonse Capone was one of the first guys to figure out how to get governments involved. We'll talk about that in a minute. But how he got governments involved. He bribed judges. He bribed politicians. He had a lot of people on the take until the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where they wiped out and killed 7 people against the wall with Tommy guns. Many movies about it. It's called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And there's actually a lot of print about that. Well, he orchestrated that to get at another mob boss that he was feuding with. He didn't even get the mob boss at that time. He got men. They thought they were getting the mob boss, but they didn't get him. But it was enough for that mob boss. I'm done. This is crazy shit. To prison. In fact, a lot of people always tell me, Larry, I didn't know you were on the same page as Al Capone. Al Capone was in the United States Penitentiary, Atlanta, where I was, when he was incarcerated for tax evasion. He was so smart, they couldn't get him on murders, or they couldn't get him on bootlegging and everything like that. They got him on tax evasion. Think of that. Al Capone got on tax evasion. He was in the same prison as me, and I'm on the same Wikipedia page as him for the United States Penitentiary, Atlanta. He ended up catching syphilis. He actually had a very bad disease of syphilis. It makes your brain go, and back then they didn't know what to do with syphilis. He ended up dying of a heart attack in 1947, and he died of, he was worth $3 billion in today's money. $3 billion was what Al Capone was worth. That is an astronomical number when you think about the times he was in. So Al Capone has to be one of the most interesting mob bosses of all time. First to corrupt politicians. Youngest, 28 years old when he became the mob boss. Ruled with an iron hand. Ended up going to prison, of course, never ratty. Dies of syphilis, but he dies actually in Florida. So Al Capone went to the sunny state of Florida to die. He ended up having syphilis, not a great life, obviously, but he has to be the number one. Now what I'm going to do is give you a couple of notable mentions I think you're going to like. Notable mention, Nicodemo Scarfo, Little Nicky Scarfo, a person I got to know pretty well. I used to walk the track with him in United States Penitentiary, Atlanta. He ended up, he was born in 1929. He ended up dying in 2017, actually in Butner, North Carolina, the prison in Butner. That's a medical facility, but he was in Atlanta his whole time. Now, Nicky became in power in 1981 after Angelo Bruno was murdered. Now, when Angelo Bruno was murdered, and it's the Philadelphia mob I'm talking about, it's American mob, but the guy who killed Bruno, he and the other guy did not get permission, which was really Nicky Scarfo, did not get permission from the American mob. And that's why Gotti's case, and when he was on it, was very, nobody gave him permission to kill Paul Castellano. But on this case, in Nicky's case, he becomes a power. He was a little tough guy in Atlantic City. They ran Atlantic City. The Philadelphia mob ran Atlantic City. And Atlantic City was in its height in the late 70s and 80s. And Nicky came to power in 1981 after Angelo Bruno was murdered. But his consigliere who planned the murder, which is Nicky, was Angelo Bruno's consigliere, which is his advisor, which was Angelo Cancellieri, he ended up being found in the trunk of a car with $300 in his mouth and $300 in his ass. And that's a sign from the mob that you're greedy, that you're just a greedy out for greed. And that's a sign. That was one of the signs. Well, Little Nicky Scarfo was known as a fucking violent murdering guy. There are stories that he killed up to 30 people and a federal judge. Those are the stories, and I heard them firsthand. I used to walk the track with Nicky in Atlanta all the time. I'd do law work. And Nicky would come to me and say to me, "Hey, lad, what do you think of my case?" And I'd be, we'd look in, walk the track, and he'd think he's going to get out. He used to say, "Man, I got a good case. I got a good case." And I'm thinking, wow, this guy fucking kills 30 fucking people, federal judge. He's getting out of fucking prison. Maybe he's fucking crazy. He was crazy. Little Nicky Scarfo was a little fucking crazy. But I'll tell you what, he was fearless. He was a boxer as a kid. I used to hear stories where he used to tell me on the track. He said, "Man, I used to box. I used to run around all day. Couldn't make it as a professional. But he was a tough kid. And he grew up in the 50s. Nicky Scarfo was born in 1929. So he grew up in, the 50s where he was a tough kid and got hooked into the mob right then and there. But Nicky Scarfo ran with an iron hand. I consider him one of the most interesting because he had a short temper, stand-up guy too. And I'll tell you what, I used to walk with the track with Nicky, after tennis. We actually had tennis courts in Atlanta, and all the mob had the back tennis court. They would play tennis, and then the politics of the mob would come in because we had 3 mob bosses. We had Vic Arena, Vic Amuso, Nicky Scarfo were right there in Atlanta with us. So it was a pretty wild time, but Nicky has to be on that notable mention. And I'm going to go on a limb, and I'm going to say the most notable mob family and most interesting mob family in the world is the United States FBI and government. If you don't think they're a mob family in their own way, come on. You got to start thinking a little bit. You could go to the Iran-Contra affair, selling drugs for people and hostages, everything, hostage situations. There are so many cases that come out about government corruption. Here's the difference. With the mob, we go to jail. With the government, they do it legally. But think about it. If you don't think they're part of this whole entire equation, then you're wrong. Because without them letting certain things go on, nothing would go on. So if you don't think the federal government is part of a mob family, I think you're a little bit mistaken. Sorry to say. I do. And don't get me wrong. I love my government, and I love my people, and I love my country. I just seen the corruption, and I'm getting to that point in my age where I see it a lot more. With that said, have a great day. This is my top 5 and notables of the most interesting mob bosses in the world. And everybody, check out my podcast, The Real Deal, with me, Larry Lawton. It's on all major platforms, Spotify, iTunes, all major podcast platforms. It's The Real Deal with Larry Lawton. And check out that episode I'm going to have right here with Randy Lanier, who is the biggest pot smuggler in the world. His last load was 180,000 pounds. 180,000 pounds of marijuana being smuggled in. It was his last, and he made, that load was $55 million. Check it out, everybody. Have a great day, everybody. Please stay safe, make good choices, don't go to prison, and I'll see you in our next video.